AskReddit by Eggless Yoke. Serious, what dark family secret were you let in on once you were old enough? Attention. Serious. Tag notice. Jokes, puns, and off-topic comments are not permitted. https://www.reddit.com/r/wiki/index-wiki_rule_6- in any comment parent or child. Parent comments that aren't from the target group will be removed, along with their child replies. Report comments that violate these rules. Posts that have few relevant answers within the first hour, and posts that are not appropriate for the serious tag will be removed. Consider doing an AMA request instead. Thanks for your cooperation and enjoy the discussion. I am a bot, and this action was performed automatically. Please contact the moderators of this subreddit. Message compose !2 =r AskReddit if you have any questions or concerns. My uncle was actually my cousin. He was kidnapped as an infant, and when he was returned a year later, my aunt didn't want him back. My grandparents adopted him, so he was legally my uncle. Kidnapped and then they didn't want him back. What the hell? Excuse me for asking, but was the kidnapping legit or was it set up to get rid of him? This is so sad. I found out I had a sister who had been given up for adoption. The only reason I found out was the person who informed me no longer felt bound to secrecy after my mom died. And the person who told me had receipts solid enough that I have no reason to doubt them. It also explains why mom freaked out when I told her I'd done a 23andMe test. 23andMe is how my father discovered he had a bonus cousin. Turns out his uncle had a fling before leaving for WWII that resulted in a child he either never told anyone about or didn't even know himself. When my father looked her, the cousin, up, she happened to live in the same city. He and my aunts contacted her and all met up for lunch. Turns out the woman had been searching for years to find her father's side of family. As far as I know, they still keep in touch. My uncle molested my mom. I don't understand how he is still welcome in the family. Familial sexual abuse is one of the most horrifying, damaging crimes, and it is also probably the most covered up, rug-swept crime. I will never understand it either. I found out when I was in my early 30s that my mom hadn't only had 4 kids, but actually 6, but gave 2 up for adoption before I was born. Also, I was the last baby she had with some rando before she married my stepdad, and she had intended to give me up for adoption as well. Silver lining? One of the babies she gave up contacted her a few years after I learned about this, and now I have an awesome new brother. Found out about a half-sibling later in life too. He's nice and I felt oddly comfortable and familiar around him immediately. It's extremely unfortunate though the rest of my family wants nothing to do with him and are mad at me for reaching out at all. I only get met with anger or non-answers when I press the issue too. My parents and sibling have all gotten really weird in the decade or so this all unfolded. There's so much going, otherwise I don't think it's the main reason, but I feel like I'm not being told something about the situation I should know. My parents took me to Disneyland for my 7th birthday. I recall landing, going to the park, having a great first day or two. Then my parents had to step out and take a bunch of phone calls. They sounded very stressed. They kept telling me nothing happened and everything was okay. Eventually we flew home, and surprise, took an extra couple days to go to a big water park away from home. I fondly remember this birthday and eventually forgot about any of the weirdness. Maybe 10 years later my parents finally told me what happened. My uncle, my dad's brother, tried to kill himself on my 7th birthday. He shot himself in the stomach with a rifle. He was poor, addicted to drugs, no work, etc. He felt depressed. My dad had a life he always wanted, so tried to kill himself. He ended up living. My parents took me to the water park so that we didn't have to come home to him leaving the hospital. By not telling me, my parents let me keep my birthday as my day, not the day uncle tried to die. Knowing how a 7-year-old's brain works, I probably would have thought I had something to do with it. Good on your parents. Is your uncle still around? My parents had 2 kids before I was born. My mother drowned them in a bathtub during a psychotic episode. Somehow, despite this and a prior history of mental illness, she got released and had me a couple years later. They had another child just before I turned 2, but I never laid eyes on her. Neither of them ever fessed up, though. I only found out about their existence after an aunt died and left me her personal effects. I found birth announcements for these other kids in her mementos. I always thought she meant for me to find them. When I asked my parents, they refused to discuss anything related to these kids. A few years later, I went back to my hometown and looked up that date in the newspaper morgue. The friend who went with me was flawed. I wasn't, really. I'd grown up in fear for my life from her ages. I broke off contact with them as soon as I could. Not just because of this, though it didn't help. I had a slew of my own traumas growing up. It was a huge mistake to let them try to raise another child. Wait, if you don't mind me asking, what do you mean I never laid eyes on her? What happened there? My paternal grandmother had an affair with our small town's mortician in the 1940s. She got pregnant and he performed an illegal abortion. The fetus was buried behind the funeral home he owned where we kids used to sled every winter. My dad told me this as I was getting ready to take a ride down the hill on the sled when I was 12. Also, paternal grandfather had multiple illegitimate children around our small town. Turns out one of my best friends was also my half-cousin. Father told me when I was 17. My father was educated, intelligent, honest and moral. The fact that his parents were so wild was absolutely shocking to me. Or, so little kid you is trying to get some sledding in and you find out you're sledding over your loved one's secret grave. That's awful. It's nice your dad was straight up with you though. My uncle didn't die in a car accident. He killed his mistress and then killed himself by crashing his car with her body in the trunk. Dude, here's a family story I refer to as the accident. 4 years my older sister's bio dad died in her accident when she was 8. She didn't find out until she was a teenager that it wasn't a car accident, it was a painted the ceiling with his brain accident. Anyway, fast forward 30 some years and my sister deals with a fuckload of mental issues, and is constantly treating her children poorly. It's Easter Sunday and our younger sister is introducing her boyfriend to our family, and it's his first meal with us. Think modern Norman Rockwell style all out meal but with a bunch of kids and family. But my older sister won't stop yelling at her kids. My dad, who has been her only active father, finally snaps and tells her to knock it off. She, a 40-something-year-old woman, pulls the "you're not my dad" line like a shitty teenager. That man goes from calm to red, stood up, veins bulging from his head and absolutely screams, "Yeah. Your fucking child molester dad blew his fucking head off. He never had to deal with your bullshit." And that's how everyone in our family found out what the accident really was and why it happened. That my grandma didn't lose her leg to cancer, she lost it because she got injured helping my grandpa fix the roof, and my grandpa was too cheap to have it fixed properly so he told the doctor to cut it off. Then he beat the crap out of her for life. I remember my mother lying on the couch in pain when I was a kid. My dad apparently would pay for her teeth repair and she had them all pulled at age 35, wore dentures until she passed at 96. That was cruel. I'm religious about my teeth getting fixed. That my biological mother used to give me heroin and Valium as a baby and toddler to control me, then drop me off at my grandmother's house when she couldn't afford to share so I'd go through withdrawals but no one would know what was wrong. Needless to say, I was put up for adoption to get me away from that. Jesus, I hope you're doing okay now. My grandpa can't have kids, but my mother still has 3 siblings. The old Jonas Venture special. I knew my grandfather was a coal miner, and that he was really involved with the union, but it wasn't till after he died that I found out just how much of a union man he was. If something needed blowing up or someone needed to not be breathing anymore, they called Gramps. After he died, my brother remembers some men coming to visit Gran and giving her a lot of envelopes. She took off for a year-long vacation in Europe after that. That's my Kermantraut. When I was very young, my family lived in a townhouse, and against all local bylaws, my mother decided to keep a horse in our backyard. Not only that, but it was an ex-race horse that came as a package deal. The goat companion that slept in the closet of my nursery. I also later found out she was running a grow up in the basement. This is so nice to read after all the other entries about child rape and murder. Not exactly dark, but I found out my father wrote porn novels under a pen name to make ends meet when I was a baby. I've been trying to find one ever since. Shame too, you might have been able to launch one of the most successful podcasts of all time if you had. My grandpa, 15, kidnapped my grandma, 14, from a convent. No one even bothered looking for her thereafter cause she was an orphan and didn't even know who her family was. They had 16 children together. It's extremely upsetting when you dig into many people's grandparents' great-grandparents' stories in my country because kidnapping young girls to marry them was considered normal. My great-aunt's husband killed his first wife, then killed her. They lived in Puerto Rico and he fled to Nick so my great-uncles wouldn't kill him. They found out where he was, came here, killed him, and went home. Edit, typo. Isn't it scary how succinct the explanation of things like this can be? I don't know about dark, but here goes. My great-grandfather murdered the mayor of the village he lived in. Why? Because the mayor was sleeping with his mom while his father worked on the field. I think he was 15 or 16 when he did that. Edit, you're wild here. When I said I don't know about dark, I meant compared to being related to serial killers, drugs, rapes and incest like some of the comments here. That's first. Second, what happened to the mom? Obviously, my great-grandfather was not this heartless, so he never told his father. He told my mom. That's my mom's grandfather. Sorry I didn't specify that he confessed to his mom on her deathbed what he did. I don't know about dark. Proceeds to tell story about infidelity and murder. Great-grandma died from a botched abortion when she got pregnant a 7th time. I knew someone whose grandmother died trying to abort number 24 in Sicily in the 40s. My dad's side of the family has ties with the Mafia. Thankfully my mom has long since divorced my dad and they live a decent distance apart. I heard stories of my mom's parents who lived close by at the time circling the block in their truck late at night soon after the divorce to ensure no one was there to hurt us. I was very young at this point, probably like 3-4, so I really have no memory of this. I do remember one night our garbage can was burned to the ground, and my mom has since told me about death threats soon after the divorce. My mom a couple years ago watched a documentary on prominent Mafia families and noted multiple names that were at her wedding. Not mine, so I won't post a top level, but her HS friend had an uncle in some variety of Lebanese mob. He'd show up to birthdays and tell us he's been there since a few hours before he really was with a bunch of Sega games with no shrink wrap. I always thought my 2 older brothers got addicted to drugs because of their own decisions and the people they hung out with. It turns out that my dad had been feeding them pills since they were about 10 to shut them up. Years I held resentment against them for not being good older brothers like they should have, only to find out that it was my father who I had praised all those years that was truly evil. Edit, wow, wasn't expecting all of this lol. Just to address some of the comments. My brothers are doing mostly fine now. Both struggled but eventually found sobriety. Luckily enough, family didn't give up on them. We have a pretty good relationship now and none of us hold anything against each other. We realize that none of us are to blame for the sins of our father. Not sure where dad is, no contact for about a decade now. In contrast, mom was and still is an angel. With her showing me who to be and my dad showing me exactly who not to be, I think I turned out pretty okay. A lot of the time the cycle just continues, but my brothers and I managed to break it. I'm sorry to everyone who has gone through something similar. Thank you for sharing your stories as well. Hope everyone finds their peace someday. Love you. Wow, that really is dark. How are your brothers doing now? Edit, typo. My dad secretly had a vasectomy after I was born, after my mom lying to him about taking birth control resulted in my birth. Our family is great at communication and conflict resolution. Lol, I'm glad we all have screwed up histories. I found my half-sister when she was 25 because my nephew did the DNA test on Ancestry.com. We pulled my dad aside to tell him what we discovered and he replied with, "That's the biggest secret that I've kept for 25 years. He was banging her married mom and got pregnant. She always felt different as she was really petite, tan skin and curly hair. None of which was in her family. Meeting her was like looking through a mirror into my childhood. She's my twin." My grandfather had severely scarred legs from burns he got as a kid. Growing up we were told that he was in a fire in an apartment building and sustained the burns while escaping. He died when I was 7, and one of my few memories of him is an image of those scarred legs. Well, when I was 23, my great aunt, his sister, told me that it wasn't a fire. Their father ran a bath with scalding water and put my grandfather in it as a punishment. Great grandfather was an abusive alcoholic piece of shit who fucking maimed his son. Not super dark or super secret, but when I had to do a project on my family tree in elementary school, one of the questions was, when did your family immigrate to America and why? For one of my great grandfathers, my grandma told me life was very hard back in his country, and it was getting dangerous to stay there, and for a long time I thought, yeah, I can see that. It was probably hard for a teenager living in Poland with WWI right around the corner. And I'm sure it was. But it turns out it's even harder and more dangerous when you're a teenager who has slept with a married woman and then accidentally killed her husband when he confronted you. I can see why she didn't want me to put that on my elementary school project. Edit, wrong World War. I just pulled up his Ellis Island records and he immigrated in 1912 aboard the Carpathia in August. This makes me wonder how many of those projects are basically lies. I bet many parents don't want their kids saying some shit like, well, after my grandma's sister was beheaded, they decided to pack up and come here. My grandmother married her second husband entirely for money. Her daughters both like to joke about her intentionally giving him a heart attack. He had heart problems but liked to eat unhealthy food, and the rumor goes she would put extra salt and butter on his food until he finally kicked the bucket. Here's a dark secret I am keeping myself. My late Phil pretty much did this to himself. My partner knows Phil stopped doing his prescribed walking and amp, ate lots of fast food after Mill died. That was too obvious to hide, since we went to live with him for a while. What I kept to myself were the multiple unopened bottles of Xaralto I found when we were clearing out that house. Also another one I've forgotten the name of. Presumably, he kept refilling the scripts so his doctor wouldn't catch on. But then he chucked them in a drawer and amp only took them when we came to visit. He died emotionally when Mill passed on. They'd been genuinely devoted to each other and amp, she was his world. It took 16 months for his body to catch up. He had a massive stroke and amp died a day or so later. When my grandma's gentleman friend was admitted into a care home for his dementia, they had a problem in verifying his medical records. As he deteriorated, he lost his Irish accent and would occasionally speak in German. He was a child during WW2. My parents reckon he was probably a Jewish escapee. This happened to my great aunt. She was a German Jew and she got Alzheimer's. She forgot her husband, then forgot she wasn't trying to escape the Nazis, then forgot how to speak English and spoke in German thinking she was a teenager, then forgot how to speak, then died. Alzheimer's is not the best. Found out one of my close relatives was a trigger man for a crime family, was killed at his daughter's school functions. The problem with killing people for money is that you're inherently working for someone who is willing to solve problems with paid homicide. What happens when they decide you know too much? I wasn't let in on it, more like I found out about it, but my siblings have a different dad than I do. That was common knowledge and not the secret at all. The secret was that their dad actually didn't die in the hospital of a terminal illness. He died of suicide when he threw himself from the window of the hospital he was slowly dying in. My grandfather didn't pass